Hey everyone, welcome to this Wednesday's live office hours. My name is Brian Robinson. I'm here in Memphis, Tennessee on a very dreary, rainy, nasty day, and I'm hoping that your Wednesday morning is treating you a little better. I'm a designer and developer. I have my own company called Code Contemporary where I try to teach designers and developers like yourself a little bit about how modern HTML, CSS, and JavaScript can be done, as well as design tips and tricks and any other questions that come up along the way. Before we get fully into things today, where we're going to be talking a little bit more about CSS Grid, which is a personal passion of mine, I do want to make sure that if you are not subscribed to my YouTube channel, that you go ahead and head on over and take a look. There's a lot of interesting videos that I'm putting out. I'm trying to put out a little bit more. I'm probably going to be doing a weekly series of design critiques as well, so that's coming up. So if you go over, subscribe, and hit that little notification button, you'll always know when I'm going live, as well as when I post a new video. But this week, we're going to be talking a little bit more about grid. And in this video, we're going to be talking about grid template columns. So 3 weeks ago, we talked about grid named lines. And this is really kind of an abstraction from that makes your code a little cleaner. If you remember, we had a whole bunch of square brackets in that, and the CSS started getting a little unruly. This helps us simplify things down a little bit and kind of get a cleaner CSS file. So let's go ahead and dive into some code. But first I want to take a look at the actual CSS specification itself around this, because if you're not looking at the specifications, you're really possibly missing out on features, because not everyone is writing blog posts about every single thing in the specification. So if you go to drafts.csswg, that's the CSS working group, .org, you can actually see all the specifications of the CSS working group, and each one of those usually corresponds to some sort of feature in CSS. In this case, I'm looking at the CSS Grid specification, and this is the grid areas part of that specification, and that's going to be what we're talking about today. It shows some very simple use case syntax on the page, as well as it gives some background into how developers at browsers are supposed to implement these things. So this is actually the ideal world, and for the most part with Grid, the ideal world matches up with how it was implemented. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example. I'm going to go ahead and go back 3 weeks and take a look at the article that we had that we converted from that kind of centralized column to having those pullouts available. And so we're going to set up a very quick, really quick grid around this. And I'm going to show a one-line grid template area. And then we're going to get a little bit more complex with the next example. So in this case, we've got HTML. Inside of our HTML, we've got some images, we've got some paragraphs, got an H1, and this class article. So I'm going to come into our CSS. We're going to do .article, and we're going to define this as a grid, so display grid. And then inside that, we're still going to specify the column values that we want, the actual size of the columns, because this shorthand is not going to take care of that for us. So we're going to say grid template columns, and we're going to say we want this to be, I don't remember what the values we used were before, but we'll have a 2rem gutter, and then we'll say it's going to have a main area with a min max of 900 pixels and 1 FR, and this is all kind of based on that tutorial I did 3 weeks ago in the live office hours before, and then we'll have another 2rem gutter over on the right hand side. Again, I'm making up these values on the fly. It can be whatever it needs to be. And then we need to actually place all of our content into the column that we expect it to be. And so I'm going to do that by I'm going to say there's a grid template area, and this syntax takes lines of string values. And so you need to have some quotation marks. And in this case, we're going to say we want this to be gutter 1, main, and gutter 2. And then inside of our article selector, we're going to have every direct descendant is going to fall into grid area main. And we have unexpected consequences of some sort happening here. Save that in. Let's go ahead and debug this in the full page view. We'll take a look at our inspector, and we will scroll over and inspect this area. And let's take a look at our grid. Okay, it is grid template areas, so there's a typo in there. There we go. All right, it's important to actually name your properties what they are specified in the specification, and you can always look at the CSS working group to do that. So now we have that centered column, and when we look at it in the full page view, it goes up and down, but we also have the fact that these images are coming up on top and that all of our stuff is actually flowing in to that that first box. And this is actually because it encourages that overlap. So this is actually not the best example I could have started us off with. So instead of doing that here, we're going to go ahead and revert this, and we're going to say we want all of these to flow into grid column 2 with a colon. There we go. And we're actually going to, instead of working on the main article body, we will work on the gallery view. And we have 4 images in this gallery, and so we're going to actually define out a new grid inside of this that has columns and rows, which is what we need to have this work well. So we're going to have a gallery class. Inside that, we're going to make this display grid, and this is going to affect these images here. So I'm going to specify that we have a grid template columns of 1 FR and then 2 columns of 0.5 FR. I'm going to explain why we're doing that here in a second. But basically that's going to give us a grid view that I want it to look like over on the right hand side. And then we're going to specify 3 grid rows. So grid template rows. In this case, I'm just going to start them at auto, and we're going to see what we need to do to change them. But I want 3 rows to start with. So we're going to come in, and we're going to actually specify on the nth children of these. So gallery image, we're going to say if it is the first child, we want to place this in a specific area. So we're going to use grid template areas, and we're going to specify 3 rows of content here. We're going to have on the right hand side, or on the left hand side, excuse me, we're going to have our first image, or we'll call it main image. And then there's a space. Each of these areas is being specified with spaces. So we'll have main image, and then we'll have second, third, and then actually we just want this to be second. So we'll say both of these are second. And then coming down here, we're going to specify a new string, so a new set of quotation marks, no semicolon at the end of that line before. We're going to have the main image continue going down in this column, and then we're going to have third and fourth. And so the great thing, I'm actually going to change this to just have 2 rows since we only had the 4 images. The great thing about this is we can actually use as many spaces inside this area as we want, and so we can align things depending on the size of the word. So if I needed the 4th to actually line up and have it be all the way over here, for whatever reason in my code, it's going to ignore everything but that first space in the white space. Don't need that here, so we'll just go ahead and bring this back on over, align that over there. Don't forget your semicolon at the end. And nothing has changed because I've just assigned names to these areas. So now I need to actually place my content into the areas themselves. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take that first child, I'm going to give it a grid area of main image. And you can see that that one on the right hand side pops on over into the second column, second row, and that's going to be how we set up that 50% large image over on the left hand side. And then we can actually specify each of the nth childs to do something different. So you'll see how I have the second one up here. I've got a keyword of second. It's going to take up 2 columns. So I actually want this to span the second and third column up there. So we're going to come in, we're going to say there's a gallery image in the nth child spot of 2. You can set up classes to do this. It doesn't really, you don't have to do this with nth child, but just for the sake of our example here, I'm going to do it that way. And we're going to specify a grid area of second, and it's automatically going to take up those 2 spots. And you can see it's also pushing the content down. So we're going to also say we want we're just going to go ahead and copy and paste this a little bit. nth child 3 is going to be in grid area 3rd, and nth child 4 is in grid area 4th. All right, so not a lot has changed, and that's because this is pushing it down. By default, images being replaced content are going to try to keep their aspect ratio. And so in our case, we want each of these to be aligned to stretch. So align items stretch. And so that left-hand side is now going to stretch down. And then we're going to have our images using, I think if you've watched one of these streams before, you know that I'm a fan of object fit. So we're going to say every gallery image is going to have an object fit property of cover to allow it to stretch and not be smushed like it was. And so now all we have to do to finish this up for my taste is to add a grid gap of, let's call it 1 rem, to add a little bit of spacing in between. And now we have this kind of asymmetric grid with very little code written. Now this works great when you're explicitly placing stuff. It's not going to work great when you're actually just trying to have content automatically flow in places. But for something like a simple image gallery where you're not actually expecting to have multiple images added in at any given time, this ends up working out pretty well. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to my second example. But I'm going to go ahead and say, if you have any questions about what I've covered so far, now's a good time to go ahead and head over to the right-hand side of your screen and type those questions into chat, and let me know if you have any questions around grid itself, grid template areas, because I know that I kind of flubbed that beginning part, forgetting that grid template areas automatically flow into one grid cell, and then really anything that you have questions on, now would be a great time to go ahead and head on over to the right-hand side of the screen and let me know. We're going to go ahead and move into another example. This is what I like to call an asymmetric promo. So in this case, we're doing kind of a cool color match where those two, they're actually tomato, the CSS keyword tomato, background colors are matching up. And it's kind of an interesting way of showing some extra white space built into an area. I actually covered this in a post on CSS Tricks. It's actually still one of my crowning achievements in my career about a year and a couple months ago. This is actually the first example in this blog post. Definitely head on over. I'll put this as a link in the description and read this post. It has a lot of great grid ideas that maybe you want to steal from me and put into your own work. But yeah, this is the finished product here. I'll actually have this in the description as well as what we work on today. And here is the static HTML for it. So it's not going to look exactly like we're going to end up with because I actually had some additional styles built in, but I want to go ahead and lay out that grid. So I'm going to come in here, and the only things I've added here are just some simple things to actually make this icon have the color of white and have that background color of tomato on both the button and the background to this area. So we have in our HTML a section of a class service. Inside that we've got our services description, which has a paragraph inside of it. We have an aside that's that icon. All that is a lovely SVG, which is embedded on the page. Sorry about the clutter in the HTML. And then we have a service CTA that has an anchor inside of it that is styled to look like a button. And then there's nothing in that kind of fourth spot because we don't actually need anything. This isn't table-based layout. So we're going to come into our CSS. At the top, we're going to specify our service class, and we need to specify this as a grid context, so display grid like we always do. And then we're going to specify our grid template columns and our grid template rows again. And this time I'm going to say it's grid template columns. I kind of want 1 FR for the description, and then I want to set a firm width on that right-hand side. So we'll at least start with, let's call it 300 pixels for now for that right-hand column. And you can see already, just by the default way the grid wants to work, we're pretty close to what we've got going on in the description. But I do want to make sure that if, for whatever reason, it's kind of protective coding, if for whatever reason some extra content gets added in here, that's going to flow correctly. So we're going to go ahead and specify our grid template rows, and we're going to have these be auto so that the text can size that itself. And then we're going to specify our service description, just so we've got it for later, our service icon. Hope if I use my beam syntax correctly, icon. and our service CTA, I think I called it. And then we're going to define our grid template areas again. So we've got grid template areas, and we're going to say we want the description to always be in that top left area. So description, and then we want our icon, and then on the next row, and we're going to go ahead and hit a return. You could just end the quotation and start a quotation, but I like to keep them kind of all separated on that right-hand side. Let's go ahead and make this a little bit bigger so we can see that. Tab indent so we can get over there. We're going to have our CTA, and then you can see here that I'm just going to add a whole bunch of spaces and keep my columns lined up. And I'm going to use a period over here, and a period denotes a blank space in our grid. So if I wanted to, I could actually specify that up here instead of down below, and that would actually clear out that area. But we'll have the icon be here. So now if I want to place everything explicitly and not just count on my source order, which let's say we actually wanted the icon to be first as opposed to being the second item in here, just to play devil's advocate here, we'll bring that up here, and you'll see that it automatically changes that order. But we can come in here and we can say our grid area for description is going to be description. For icon will be icon. And for CTA, it will be CTA. Excellent. Grid area, CTA. So this allows you to explicitly name things, explicitly set them up in a way that later on you're going to expect it to continue to be. So that's pretty important in a lot of ways. It is a very descriptive way of dealing with grid areas. So much like the named lines that we talked about a few weeks ago, this allows you to name things in a way that allows you to use them for their exact purpose, as opposed to just allowing the grid algorithm to kind of take over there. And actually, now that I'm looking at this color coding, I'm betting that honestly this icon keyword is actually a bad keyword to use. So we'll say this is the, we'll call it the service icon, just to be completely explicit and make sure we don't run into any issues. Didn't really matter in this example, but it's always good to be on the safe side and make sure that you're guarding against using a protected keyword in CSS, because unlike JavaScript, it's not going to error. It's just going to ignore that line and move on with its life. So those are a couple examples of using grid template areas. There's an additional shorthand, which I'm not going to go into detail on here, but it allows you to actually specify your grid template columns, grid template rows, and grid template areas all in one go. Let's see if it's in here. Grid dash area. It's called grid template, I believe. Yeah, and so it actually allows you to specify your row size, your column size, and your grid template areas all in one little area. So we'll go ahead and try that. I've actually never used this syntax before. It's a little bit, in my opinion, it's a little bit wonky, just because there's a lot going on in one little shorthand. I feel like shorthands are oftentimes kind of an anti-pattern in CSS, but it's kind of nifty to have everything in one spot. So let's go over to our asymmetric grid, and let's see if I can do this in my first try. So we're going to specify our row for this is auto, and then our slash is going to show our columns, which are going to be like this. And then down here we've got auto, and believe we have to type it again, but I could be wrong on that. And semicolon. Let's see how I flubbed it. Again, never use this one to do what I'm looking to do here. So the syntax says it takes grid template rows, grid template columns. That. All right, let's head back over here. I don't think I want to find that here. Out of curiosity, let's go ahead and we're gonna open this up in Firefox Nightly and take a look at it in its grid inspector. Debugging is always important to learn how to do. change view, go to full page, and bring this on over to the right hand side. All right, so we're going to come in, inspect our element. We're going to find that grid. You can see that grid now only has that one row defined, and that's because it's really not liking that syntax. So let's go back in. So you play with new things on stream. You never know what you're going to get. If you have any questions, be sure to go ahead and toss them up into the chat while I debug this. Here, refresh the page, and we're going to take a look. I bet nothing has changed here yet. Still not liking that. It would help if I used the right property. So let's come in here. It's not actually grid template areas, it's just grid template. And I bet my first syntax was perfectly fine for grid template, if not for Also, my internet is really not liking streaming and using this, but we'll be fine. Okay, yeah, it certainly is not liking the syntax I'm using there. Let's just try defining it on one. Give it one more chance. Yeah. All right. I will prepare that for next week or for a video that I'll post on my YouTube channel. That is not where I was expecting it to go. But yeah, grid template is a very kind of, it's not wonky, but it's a very powerful shorthand that just you have to know exactly how fiddly to get it to work how you want it. There's a specific syntax order, and obviously I don't have that down. But in this case, we've got a description, an icon, and a CTA, and then we've also played around and made a gallery view over here, main image stacked over 2 rows, and then a second image put along 2 columns, and then a third and a fourth in 1 row and 1 column. So in the end, that's what I have for you today, grid template areas. They were really my first kind of love in grid. After I played with the specification a little bit, I converted a chunk of my blog's list page over to using grid template areas explicitly. And it was very interesting. I was able to do kind of a funky layout very easily and very explicitly working with those named areas. I've not fallen out of love with grid template areas. It's a very powerful tool, but it's kind of a smaller use case compared to the extra power of additional named lines that you get using that named line syntax, which you can go back, like I said, a couple office hours ago, I talked about it. That's kind of a much bigger, broader set of power, where this is a very specific, explicit power. So yeah, that's where we're kind of at right now in terms of what we're talking about today. So if there aren't any questions, we'll go ahead and call it a day, but I'll go ahead and give maybe a few seconds for y'all to go ahead and enter them in on the right-hand side of your screen in that, or maybe down below, depending on how you've got it set up in that chat window. And I'm going to go ahead and plug a couple things. I do have a new company called Code Contemporary, codecontemporary.com. Where I'm posting online courses, and I do have a roughly 2-hour course on CSS Grid. It covers a lot of the basics. We don't talk a lot about grid template areas in it. We do cover it in one exercise, but it's a much smaller use case, because I do think that overall getting up and running with Grid in under 2 hours. Template areas is a little bit of a smaller use case than you need. But it's 5 exercises. It's about an hour and a half, maybe an hour 45 minutes. It covers everything that you need to know to get going with Grid. So I do want to go ahead and point that out. I'll put a link in the description to that as well. And then I'm writing regular blog posts and posting YouTube videos here and over on my personal site, brianlrobinson.com. Link in the description for that as well. I do, like I said, plan on creating some design critique videos. So if you do have some design work that you're working on or some websites that you're building, I'd love to take a look, as long as you don't mind me posting a video about it on this channel to give you some tips and tricks around kind of my experience in the design world, which is a little over 13 years doing design work now. So definitely hit me up if you're interested in that. Hit the subscribe and notifications buttons down below so you're always notified of everything that I've got going on here at Code Contemporary. And then if nothing else, I will see you next Wednesday at 10 a.m. for my next live office hours. And we'll see you then. Thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time.